right, well, I'll go ahead and get started, and everyone else can filter in as they will. Welcome to the inaugural webinar in our Innovations in Legacy Cities webinar series. On behalf of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and the Legacy Cities Initiative, I'm delighted to have you here. Before I dive in, I want to give a quick note about how we're going to handle questions on this webinar. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, but no need to wait until then to ask a question. There is a Q&A button on the bottom of the webinar screen, and you can go ahead and enter a question in there any point during any of our comments. And I'll go through the questions in the end and get to as many questions as I can. If you have a technical problem, please use the chat function to let us know what's going on, and someone from the Lincoln staff will help you as best they can. Now, with that out of the way, down to business. The Lincoln Institute of Land Policy is an independent organization that seeks to get research, tools, and good practices into the hands of practitioners so they can use land as a tool to improve the lives of the people who live on and around it. We've been working on legacy city issues for over a decade now, and the Legacy Cities initiative was in the works for at least 2 years before we finally launched it. But the context that we were preparing for the initiative was not the one that 2020 decided to throw at us. As we watch cities cope with the pandemic and its resulting recession, as well as the movement for racial justice that has swept the country, it became clear that two issues were going to be the defining ones for many city leaders this year and beyond: fiscal health and equity. So we designed this webinar series with those two issues in mind. This one in particular is designed to counter the false idea that a recession and declining municipal revenues will cause work on equity to grind to a halt. While many strategies to advance equity in planning do require investments, not all do. And today we're going to go through several strategies you can enact with limited resources, and then hear from two practitioners who are putting those strategies into action. The legacy, oh my goodness, excuse me. I think I have a poltergeist. Anyway, there we go. The webinar series, as I mentioned, is part of a larger effort, the Legacy Cities Initiative. It is a national network of community and government leaders working to create shared prosperity and bring attention to the common needs and tremendous importance of older industrial cities around the country. The Legacy Cities Initiative practices in 3 main ways. We conduct research, working with partners like the Urban Institute and the Center for Community Progress on topics like greening legacy cities, the role of state policy in urban revitalization, and how to use cutting-edge tools like scenario planning to help prepare for declining or stagnating populations. We also focus on education, webinars like this one, published reports, and our website, legacycities.org, which contains a great deal of data and resources for practitioners. Finally, we're building and supporting networks. We want to connect practitioners so you can share your common challenges and your innovative approaches to those challenges. We'll have more on networks coming soon, but our first major opportunity is a community of practice that we are launching in January 2021. This will be a year-long virtual effort for interdisciplinary city teams that provides them with learning, faculty, and resources. We'll ask the city teams to approach a policy issue that's been a thorn in their side for a while, but has been made worse by the challenges of 2020, and then dig in to a more specific place-based strategy, either to learn more about the problem or to pilot a solution. We'll provide the city teams with access to a mentor who will talk with them at least monthly, a slate of faculty who will share their expertise, access to their peers working in other cities, as well as the chance to deepen their connections within the city, which I think can often be a tremendous benefit within these programs. Perhaps most importantly, we'll also offer the cities $10,000 to advance their problem, whether it be through deeper data collection, putting on a community meeting, whatever is needed to take their effort to the next level. There's still time to express interest in this program. The deadline for expressions of interest is at the end of the month. It's not an onerous program, so please do submit your expression through the URL on the screen Or if you have questions, you can email Jess Wunsch at Lincoln. Her email is jwunsch@lincolninst.edu. A couple other opportunities I want to make you aware of before we dive into the substance. Our second webinar in our series is coming up in about a month, November 18th at 11 a.m. And this one is really thinking about the probably inevitable budget cutting process that many cities are going to find themselves in, and how to do that in a way that is as responsive to community needs and transparent to the community as possible. We also have a policy focus report coming out hopefully in March 2021, Equitably Developing America's Smaller Legacy Cities. And this will go more into depth on some of the strategies we've talked about today. If you are interested in either the webinar or the policy focus report, you can sign up for our mailing list to be notified of those things. Go to legacycities.org for the link to sign up. All right, now the important stuff. Today, I'm going to share 3 strategies for how to advance your equity agenda, even as you tighten your purse strings. We're all here because we think equity is a priority, not a nice to have, not something that you can put on hold while you deal with other more pressing issues. In these strategies, we've tried to give you not just the what of the recommendations that we think will be useful for you, but some insights or resources to help you with the how as well. Pointers for places that have already implemented these strategies, or toolkits or resource websites that might be useful for you as you're digging in to get more information. The first strategy is around doing what you can with your existing resources. We wanted to find strategies that didn't require new one, but all cities and towns have some resources they have control over. So step 1 is making sure that those resources are doing everything they can to advance equity in your place. For the first recommendation, let's looking at capital expenditures. Our speaker, Stephanie Smith, will tell you in great detail about the city of Baltimore's effort there, so I won't spend a lot of time on that recommendation. The next one is on developing equity criteria for recipients of funding, like economic development funding, and holding them accountable to advancing the goals that you've set for them. The city of Austin has been doing a good job in this, and their economic development department has performance-based incentives that businesses have to demonstrate compliance with. If you want to learn more about this, the policy link All in Cities webpage has a great deal of information here. Finally, this one is perhaps a little bit wishful thinking because no one has a crystal ball at this point, but assuming there are recovery funds coming at some point from someone, we need to make sure that those recovery funds are used to advance equity and going to the communities and neighborhoods that need them the most. Several organizations like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and nonprofits like Change Lab and Equity Alliance have put together guidelines for what this might look like. But again, this is a very emergent strategy, and so I hope you all will let us know if you end up implementing something around this so we can pass it on in our next effort. I want to set up our second strategy around transparency and resident power in decision-making with a little bit of a discussion of the journey that governments go on as they seek to become more responsive and accountable to their residents. Changing the processes that we use to make decisions is a fundamental strategy for advancing equity. But I think more than many, this is a journey. This is not an on-off switch where either you're doing it or you're not. This is something where even the most advanced city can always take it a step further or do more. A friend of mine who's a community organizer said of traditional planning that it was DAD planning, decide, announce, defend. And I think we all know that that style of planning isn't what we want. But there are a lot of steps between that and true resident control of decision-making processes. What we recommend is that wherever your city is on this continuum, you take 1 or 2 more steps down the ladder. So now we'll talk about specific steps at different points in the continuum. At the most basic, we all need to get really good at informing the public of what we're doing and soliciting and hearing their feedback. The first 3 recommendations are about getting good in that process. Recommendation 1 has actually been accelerated in some very interesting ways by the pandemic. Virtual meetings, for example, are often easier for residents to attend than in-person meetings. And cities like Louisville are experimenting with things like phone lines to get input from residents even when they don't have internet. The second strategy is about giving residents the tools they need to participate in planning processes meaningfully. Philadelphia is a good example. They have the Citizens Planning Institute, which helps residents decode the language and processes used to make planning decisions. It's one of an increasing number of programs designed to accomplish this goal. Building relationships with community organizations is another essential piece of the puzzle here, particularly in areas with histories of mistrust or suspicion towards the government. Lancaster, Pennsylvania has done an incredible job of this, and they engaged many of the city's community groups in an effort to create a plan to cut the city's poverty rate in half in 15 years. The commission that produced the plan was a collaboration of nonprofit and public organizations, and it even led with a formal apology for the city's role in its history of segregation and a vow to do better. The next step on the ladder of real resident power is increasing resident representation in decision-making. The Chelsea Collaborative here in Massachusetts has worked with the city to empower its Latinx residents to participate in the political process and run for political office. They do some tremendous training and education programs to make this happen. And as a result, the leadership of the city looks far more like the makeup of its residents than it ever has before. Finally, there's the top rung of the ladder, placing real decision-making power with the residents who are impacted by those decisions. I think participatory budgeting is the best example that we have so far of what it looks like to make government decisions in this way. And I encourage you to visit the Participatory Budgeting Project's website for a number of examples about what this looks like and where this has been done in practice. Finally, strategy 3 is about laying the groundwork for the return. No recession lasts forever. Everyone has a bottom and there's nowhere to go but up. And the bottom is the perfect place to think about laying the groundwork for the kind of growth and development you want when things do turn up. Louisville, as we'll hear, is already thinking about adjusting the zoning codes that they have to make sure that they are working to desegregate and enhance equity in their city. Minneapolis has also done some of this in their work to eliminate single-family zoning. You can also think about enacting housing stabilization policies like just cause eviction protections. We all know that a storm is coming as far as housing goes, and I think people in gentrifying neighborhoods are going to be particularly vulnerable to the housing instability that comes from that. Just cause eviction protections are a good way to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected and not evicted without cause. Finally, this is a good time to think about getting systems in place for figuring out what you're going to do with your land when development does heat up. Community land trusts and land banks are great ways that cities can work with nonprofit partners or others to consolidate and distribute underutilized land. The Grounded Solutions Network has a tremendous body of resources on community land trusts, and the Center for Community Progress is a good place to go for more information about land banking. With all of these strategies, though, while they are low cost, they are not without their political challenges. No equity work is easy, and some of these are tough nuts to accomplish. But I think there are ways that we can move the needle and be prepared to act when the time comes. We need to have the right coalitions in place and think about what we can do to make sure that opponents are neutralized or their arguments are less powerful. Washington, D.C. did a great example of this recently when they came out with their affordable housing plan. They mapped where in the city affordable housing had been built, showing visually and very compellingly that the poorest neighborhoods had received vastly more affordable housing than the wealthier neighborhoods. That made it much more challenging for opponents in wealthier neighborhoods to argue against taking their fair share when the time came. This brings me to messaging, which I think is also a crucial part of the equity political puzzle. There are ways to use this moment in particular, like the recession and pandemic or the movement for racial justice, to frame your issue in a way that speaks to audiences that might not have wanted to hear it in other cases. Louisville did a good job of this, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. There are many organizations working on equity framing, like the Frameworks Institute and The Case Made, that have resources for thinking about how to structure an argument that makes it compelling even to those who are not inclined to listen to the issue otherwise. Finally, having the groundwork laid in terms of data analysis, recommendations, being ready to go when the time is right is really important here. We never know when the political moment is going to come. No one knew that 2020 was going to happen the way that 2020 has happened. So it really makes a difference that you are poised and ready to go when the right moment occurs. So now I'm going to introduce two fabulous women working in two legacy cities to advance their visions of equity. First, we're going to hear from Stephanie Smith, who's the Associate Director for Equity, Engagement, and Communications for the City of Baltimore's Planning Department. She's going to tell us all about Baltimore's equity analysis of its capital expenditures. Next, we'll hear from Emily Liu, Director of Planning and Design at Louisville Metro, who will tell us about their ongoing efforts to make their zoning code more equitable. As I said in the beginning, we'll have a Q&A at the end, but please feel free to pop up your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box as they occur to you. So with that, I will hand the reins over to Stephanie. Oh, Stephanie, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I said, let me just go ahead and share my presentation. Just a moment. All right. Okay, can everyone see on my screen? I think it's coming up in a second here. Sometimes there can be a delay. Let me stop the share and try it one more time.
Oh, technology. There we go.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, I see what I was trying to do. All right. Why is it acting like that? Okay, I want to make it bigger. Let me just, okay, boom, we're in business. All right, hello everyone, good morning. Again, I just want to thank the Lincoln Institute for providing this opportunity for legacy cities to share, to learn from one another, and to also, as she noted, really think intentionally around how we not only develop equity kind of perspectives, but further kind of just double down on the commitments we've already made around addressing equity issues through our work with planning, community development, and related topics. So Baltimore has been working on equity issues for a minute now, and a lot of this was led by the Department of Planning. And we're hoping now that we have a citywide law that requires all agencies to think about their equity work, that this will actually empower us to go deeper and to go in a more robust way through some of our pre-existing commitments. So I just want to just go over the top level discussion points for my presentation. I want to just briefly kind of, ground the conversation in kind of the history of inequity in our city and how it brings us to the moment that we find ourselves in right now. Also discuss how principles of sustainability are also driving our efforts around developing a more equitable city. One of the great things about our Department of Planning in the city of Baltimore is that the Office of Sustainability for the city is a division of our agency. So that really has been a huge value add to the work around equity. And then also, as Jess mentioned, COVID-19 in many ways is only revealing more acutely challenges that many of us were already aware of. But within that kind of, peeling back of layers, I think there's not only a deeper recognition of challenges, but also some opportunities that maybe we should be thinking outside the box about, despite some of the challenges around revenue. And then of course, after Emily concludes her presentation, we'll engage in Q&A. So I look forward to that. So just briefly, this is the cover of the New York Times on Christmas Day, 1910, and it's basically saying, you know, Baltimore has adopted the most drastic Jim Crow plan to date. And I think this is really important to lift up, is that Baltimore has been, unfortunately, at the vanguard of advancing notions of racial segregation, and was also one of the first major cities to adopt an ordinance of such a stringent ordinance that prevented Black people from moving to majority white Blacks and vice versa. And this was all launched because a Black attorney decided to move onto McCullough Street, and it set forth community concerns that rose all the way to the mayor and city council, and they adopted this very measure that was covered quite comprehensively in the New York Times on Christmas Day in 1910. So I want to bring you to this map. The one to my left here is what is often referred to as the redlining map, or the formal name of it was the 1937 Residential Security Map of Baltimore City. And I know the people on this call are very aware of what redlining means in terms of the denial of access to mortgages and what that really means for wealth development in our city. The reason why I show this map is that despite the fact that redlining is obviously unconstitutional practice, it's important to note that the legacy of redlining lives with us now in our various departments of planning, because there's still a muscle memory to these abandoned policies that live out in the private sector and in other behaviors that government participates in. And so I wanted to highlight the map to my right. Within the Department of Planning, we are also home to the city's food policy initiative. So in many ways, this map that is assessing the healthy food priority areas, sometimes referred to as food deserts, I think in the common vernacular, we call them healthy food priority areas, mainly because there's not an absence of food, there's an absence of healthy food, but you can see that the areas that were traditionally redlined and yellow-lined in the 1937 map are some of the same areas that are finding it challenging to find access to food. So I just wanted to kind of ground this conversation in, as legacy cities, we have a legacy of policies that have been harmful to wealth development, to equitable transportation access, and to truly creating the type of world that we wanted to live in pre-COVID, and that we desperately need to continue moving towards creating through and after COVID. So I wanted to share that our agency has our own equity statement, and we looked at various equity statements for cities across the country, but we really wanted something that kind of knit together our priorities as an agency. So collectively, we settled on this statement, and I want to lift up that this statement is a living statement. We are continuously thinking about how it should be revised and also amended to be most applicable to the moment we find ourselves in. So when you're working on equity work, I don't think there's ever a day when you go, that's it, that's the day. It got all equitable. So I just want to challenge people that no matter what they're doing, to always feel open to reassessing where they are. And I think, I know all of you can read, but I just want to emphasize particularly the last part, that Equitable Baltimore addresses the needs and aspirations of its diverse population and meaningfully engages residents through inclusive and collaborative processes to expand access to power and resources. And those last few words, expand access to power and resources, were a particular focus of our staff, because as Jesse kind of went through the different levels of engagement we as anchors and government entities have with communities. Some of it can be quite shallow. It could be merely an announcement of what we're already going to do, but it could also be something much more impactful, as really making sure that resident voice is leading and driving the building of agendas, and not simply just responding to an agenda that we, as the maybe major stakeholders, have taken. So as I mentioned, because the Office of Sustainability is a part of the Department of Planning, we as a city are a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And as such, that provides us with an equity lens that we use for our work. It's a 4-part lens that's fairly, I think, easy to follow, particularly for folks that may be kind of new to thinking about some of these equity concepts. But I wanted to lift up particularly procedural equity. In many ways, there isn't necessarily a law that needs to be changed in order for some of our outcomes within our agencies or organizations to be more equitable. Sometimes it's simply assessing or reviewing policies and procedures and norms that really don't have to play out the way they've played out thus far, but we sometimes accept as static and that we can't move. So for us, I think we realized that our capital budget, the way for community members to assess it, to feed into it, and to provide any level of influence, it was a rather opaque process. It really wasn't accessible to people the same way our operating budget was. And for us as an agency, the Department of Planning, we really took special ownership of that, because under the charter for the city of Baltimore, we are in the unique position of being responsible for preparing the capital budget for the city. So, to the extent we're advancing equity in our agency and through the different programs of influence that we have control over, we felt the capital budget was the perfect area for us to really look at the procedures that we are engaging in, and in light of COVID, see how we can further think outside the box about including more of the public in these processes. So as I mentioned, we've been working on equity issues as an agency for a little over 5 years. So preceding the death of Freddie Gray in police custody and the subsequent uprising of April of 2015, we as an agency were already working on these issues. So we have an equity action plan that's a 5-point plan, and it's really focused on increasing our connections with underserved communities, ensuring that our agency staff reflect city demographics. We are a city that's 2/3 Black, but in many ways, and that are probably unsurprising to most participating in this webinar, that there's pipeline and other challenges that I think are surmountable, but I think we really want to be more focused on improving our staff racial composition. And then we also wanted to develop an equity assessment tool, not only for the capital budget, but for a lot of our major citywide plan development opportunities. And then as I highlighted, we wanted to use an equity lens to prioritize capital investments. And then lastly, just continuously evaluate our internal practices and policies. So the capital improvement program, I know most people here understand what it's about. It's about those investments in the built environment, such as roads, monuments, public art, things of that sort. And as you probably can imagine, when you look at a city budget, our overall city budget is about $3 billion. And given in any given fiscal budget year, of that $3 billion, anywhere from 15 to 30% of that is capital. And then the remainder would be our operating budget. Because we are now living in the reality of COVID, we're a lot closer to that 15% than the 30 in terms of the composition, because revenues have obviously been slashed, across the country, and Baltimore is no stranger to that. But nonetheless, we still think it's important that we needed to conduct an equity analysis. We did some preliminary work around that beginning in 2017. And then we were able to do some additional internal analyses, and then finally work with some partners at the University of Baltimore to do to have some third-party review of our equity the equity analysis of our capital investments. And we realized through each iteration of that analysis that there were definite recommendations that were jumping out at us. One was we needed increased ways to really utilize or access resident input into this process. And we also needed more data transparency. I wish I was in the room with you guys, because I think no matter what we're doing, we could all mouth the words increase data transparency about just about anything, because it doesn't seem like there's a challenge that any of us are facing that couldn't be better improved by some more data. So for us, what that data transparency really meant was that the various sister agencies that were making their capital requests to us historically did not always have address or location data tied to the request. So beginning 2 fiscal years ago, we started requesting to the extent possible, can you please include some location data in your request so that we can truly map at the beginning where these requests are intended to be applied so that we're not always looking backwards. So at this point, anywhere from 20 to 60% of the capital requests coming to us, depending on the agency, do have location data, but there's still some location blind spots that we think once filled will give us a better sense of how we can better attack this. So I wanted to just jump in because 2 of the big pots that we really looked at were where was the capital funding going based on communities, looking at the racial composition of communities. And then we also looked at it from an income breakdown. Now, one of the things I mentioned, we use this 4-part equity lens developed by USDN. And one of them is distributional equity. And that's how our power or resources distributed within a population or a geography. As you know from the maps I showed, to just your probably common familiarity with Baltimore as a legacy city, we are a city that's still rather hyper-segregated in terms of racial segregation. So in many ways, analyzing spatial distribution of investments is still almost a proxy for analyzing the distribution by race. It's not a perfect measure, but it's unfortunately still strongly correlated. So we looked at the 3-year average per capita of the CIP allocations for fiscal years 14 and 16, and then we also looked at 15 through 17. And that's how we were kind of, trying to see if there were some improvements or a trend at all that could be assessed by looking at those different points in time. So we really wanted to look at our communities with the highest concentrations or proportions of Black residents. Are they receiving less, mid-range, or even more investment from our capital program versus our communities that have the lowest composition of Black residents? So what we did see in fiscal years 16-18 was that funding was shifting towards communities with the highest percentage of Black residents. So there's a couple of things we wanted to know. It's like, well, why, right? So when you look at some of those historical maps that I referenced, if you were to look at our housing market typology that we create right now to assess the housing market strength of various parts of Baltimore City, it unfortunately does mirror in many respects the redlining map. So there have been efforts across multiple administrations in the past 3 years to really look at those historically disinvested communities and do some targeted place-based investments that are very much long overdue. So to an extent, we started to realize that fiscal years 16 and 18 was the realization of some efforts that had been put into motion even a decade plus to getting some of those targeted investments to come to bear. Some of those investments were contemplated even earlier than 10 years ago, but were delayed and stymied by the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. So it just goes to show that, you can have a really great master planning process. For example, Park Heights in Northwest Baltimore, home to the Preakness. I have a Kentuckian coming on after me, so she knows about horse racing. So, there was a huge master plan around that community that truly kind of, suffered a setback, when we had the Great Recession. So by the time we're doing this equity analyses, we're actually able to identify that trend where we're actually seeing some of those investments come online. But it was really interesting to kind of see that. And I gave a different view of it because some people might be more visual like myself. So we saw that high percentage, Black communities, their per capita investments, have really improved from fiscal years 14 through 16 to 16 through 18. Now, when we track, by neighborhood median household income for those same years, fiscal years 16 through 18, what we found pretty interesting here, let me move this because I'm blocking any info for you, is that the total per capita CIP allocation in communities with the median household incomes between 34 to 39,000 consistently had the highest value across all time periods. So that was something we thought was a bit stunning. It wasn't necessarily our, most hard hit communities, which, in some ways could make sense, like maybe they need some, boost right now, but it definitely wasn't our wealthiest communities either. So I think, many of the efforts that Jesse mentioned that Lincoln will be undergoing across Legacy City improvement and support, I think there's probably going to be strong conversations about how to support middle neighborhoods in that, I just suspect. And to me, this speaks to, we have an emerging middle neighborhood strategy within our city, not just within our agency specifically. And I think that maybe some of these investments maybe can show an unconscious, kind of consideration of the need to support communities that are on that bubble. They have some real points of strength, but then also have some challenges that, if left unchecked, could really, lead to some decline. So that's something that we thought was interesting, because you go into these efforts addressing equity with some level of assumption until you get data to clarify and to help you hone your direction and your efforts. But I think what was really important for us to dig into when we looked at community statistical areas to make it even a little more manageable, because we are a city of roughly 280 neighborhoods, which makes Baltimore beautiful and wonderful and vibrant, but also a bit challenging for planners, because sometimes people, if it's not outside their window, they might not feel the amenity or the effort is happening to them. So sometimes we have to lift up that we have to look a little higher to really assess if something's a community benefit or not. So our friends at the University of Baltimore and the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, they've created a community statistical area concept that clusters like communities on a geographic basis. So you're looking at 57 community clusters versus, hundreds of smaller communities. And one of the things that we noticed through that clustering effect is that it's really important to tease out if an investment has more of a neighborhood, a local, or a regional benefit. So for some of our neighborhoods in West Baltimore, it became apparent that investments and improvements to the reservoir really drove up what that community statistical area's allotment of the capital budget appeared to be. But for that resident, that doesn't feel like a neighborhood benefit, because it's benefiting the region. It's not just benefiting them. So when we were able to tease out across those 57 CSAs neighborhood level investments, we did continue to see increased funding and our more upwardly mobile communities than our lowest tiered. But that was important for us to be able to tease out, because it's very different between a reservoir that's going to not only help improvement program that's not only going to help Baltimore, but even our neighboring jurisdictions that utilize our water, versus a bocce ball court in Little Italy. Very different feel of, is this a local benefit or a neighborhood benefit, or is this a bigger benefit? And without this analysis, you wouldn't be able to speak, to this with our community members and with other agencies. So we came away with probably more recommendations coming out of we had 3 iterations of this analysis. And, one of the ones that I'm really excited about is really getting agencies to engage in their own individual agency equity analysis earlier in the CIP review, because one of the things we realized is, yes, we do prepare the capital budget for the city, but the input is coming from our sister agencies. So to the extent that they appreciate equity or have some type of system to evaluate it in their own requests, it really does impact our ability to synthesize the overall portfolio of investment requests in a way that really honors equity at the most optimal level. We also, because the Department of Public Works takes up at any time 2/3 to 3/4 of our capital budget, but the thing is, they have a lot of enterprise funds from, providing water, and other type of services that go into that. So we were really focused on the part of the CIP that was more discretionary, that didn't have enterprise funds backing their requests. So, our housing and community development, our transportation agency, all of these other functions of city government are really kind of looking at an ever decreasing pie, rec and parks. So we want to make sure that we have a more active review of utility funded projects, because we just want to make sure that we're getting cost savings wherever we can by really staying on top of the timelines. And we've been having some really good partnerships with DPW about getting a better handle on that. We also want to figure out how we can just change business practices to be better at assessing equity. So there's two huge developments here in just the past 2 months that I want to share. One, in a time when we were told that we could not fill any vacant positions in city government, and I'm sure many people have heard something similar in their respective jurisdictions, the finance department saw value in us filling an asset management role within the Department of Planning that would also work in conjunction with their office around better assessing the physical conditions of our city portfolio of buildings, because we really don't have a coherent sense, independent, the kind of snapshots that are given from various agencies, but even they sometimes have some limitations in even assessing some of the challenges, for example, the Department of General Services that is, operating and supporting our fire departments, police districts, as well as libraries, and other, senior centers, all these various concerns. Maybe we could be making far more strategic investments with these limited CIP dollars if we were really intervening at the most optimal time with certain investments. Sometimes we're just really always at the most fraught and dangerous moment where the roof is falling off or something is sinking, and we really need to get a better handle on the physical condition of our buildings in a systematic way, and a way that data can be shared across agencies. So the fact that our city hall saw that this role was a path to future cost savings by having someone shepherding that conversation across the various agencies, we see that as a big win in a time where you don't get a lot of wins when it comes to the budget. So we're very happy about that. And then also, one of the things that we felt was needed to better kind of improve the equity outcomes of our investments across our capital budget is to really just figure out how we can have more oversight beyond the respective, CIP planners in an agency. So I remember a few years ago, we participated in the Lincoln Institute's big city planning directors meeting, where we were able to do some workshopping with Seattle, and we learned that Seattle had a sub-cabinet just for the CIP and equity. So we're trying to create a version of an equity oversight committee for the CIP that includes people across city government and city hall, and even some people outside of government, so that there's a better coherent conversation around how we can have targeted investments on a place-based effort, while also not sacrificing the need to center equity through this process. So we're really excited about that. And then we also—
Stephanie, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is really interesting, but I want to make sure that we have time for Emily.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This is your job. So boom, I'll put it up right here.
I do want to reassure everyone that we're going to post the slides online, and I'm sure you can follow.
This is my last slide. This is literally my last slide.
Okay, yeah. Wonderful. Thank you.
So I just want to, I know that Jesse had mentioned earlier that Philadelphia has a Citizens Planning Institute where they really try to improve regular people's understanding of planning. And we are in the 4th cohort of our own planning academy. It's virtual this time. It actually concludes this evening, but we focus on CIP. We focus on a lot of these systems. And I'm just pleased to say that alums of the Planning Academy have received a state designation for the first Black Arts District in Baltimore. And even one member of the Planning Academy alumni cohort is now a member of our planning commission. So getting people beyond just letting them know what's going on, but making them a part of the program has been really exciting. And applications were weighted for those who lived in the weakest housing markets. So we really want to make sure we're lifting up the voices of those that have been most disconnected from the land use and development system. So thank you so much. So sorry.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie. Emily, you're up.
Hello, everyone. I'm trying to put my screen up here. Okay, can you see my presentation on the screen?
I think we still need to go to presenter mode.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about this very important subject.
I think you're still not in presenter mode. We can see the slides and the notes.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me go back.
There we go. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you. You can see my screen, right? All right, good. I'm sure you have heard about Louisville probably a lot lately, but I still would like to give you an introduction of the city, more kind of on the line of planning and zoning background. So Louisville, first of all, Louisville is a consolidated government. Back about 17 years ago, the city of Louisville and Jefferson County merged. So we are a big city in terms of square miles. We're 400 square miles. Think about Washington, D.C. is about 49 square miles. So we are huge. The population as of last year is about 767,000, and we're projected to continue to grow. We're going to grow about 130,000 in the next 20 years. The good news is we are one planning commission. We are one comprehensive plan, even though as big as Louisville Metro is. We are, however, have 13 different zoning authorities. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. So about a year ago, Louisville Metro conducted and also adopted its latest comprehensive plan. So January 1st, 2019, this comprehensive plan became effective. It engaged a lot of citizens during the process. This comprehensive plan identified 5 different principles. We call it CHASE, and one of the principles is equity, which focuses on the community diversity and recognizes that resources, opportunities, and outcomes must be shared by all. I realized early on that we have so much going on this year. Jesse mentioned, hope nothing, especially equity-related work, will come to a complete halt. We are actually just on the other side. We actually accelerated a lot of the work we've been doing. So as a part of a comprehensive plan, we identified housing is need assessment. So that's something the community tells us we need a housing need assessment. We never have a housing element in the comprehensive plan. So this newest comprehensive plan is the first time we ever added a housing element. So this housing need assessment was completed last year. At the same time, we're working on other things. Advancing equity, this document was actually produced in-house. This is something staff really want to do. This also kind of implement some of the action plan that the mayor outlined. We were working on the action plan related to advancing equity. So this is what our office did. This explores topics including some of the inequity and barriers in our existing regulation, practice, and policies. And it also explored a lot of subjects as well, including parking, economic accessibility, and some other zoning related topics. And also in February this year, starting in February, we hired a consultant from California and conducted a zoning diagnosis with a focus on housing. Many elements within our zoning ordinance have not been revised actually back since 1960s. Several components of the land development code really restrict a lot of different type of development and still very exclusive at this point. So those elements have been identified. So everybody knows, well, the study is underway and it's just about to wrap up. We all know at the end of May, we have this big social movement that takes place everywhere in the United States. People calling for reform in the police, people calling reform for justice system. At the same time, we're asking ourselves, the planners here, asking ourselves, what we as planners can do to help dismantle the systemic racism that exists in many aspects of our life, including land use policies, land use laws, and land use practices. So we work closely with the mayor's office. We also approached Metro Council and the Planning Commission. It turned out to be a very easy ask. So the mayor's office has been in several years working on equity in Louisville. We established the Office of Equity, and also we are one of the first city that appointed a chief equity officer. And Metro Council at the same time was in the process of establishing a new committee called Equity and Inclusion. And as mentioned earlier, that we have 13 different jurisdictions. So Metro Council have zoning authority in the county, most of the county, probably more than 80% of the county. But there are still other cities also have jurisdiction on the zoning issue. However, I mentioned earlier, we have only one planning commission. So we also approached the planning commission about doing some reform work with the land development code. It looked like everybody agreed. We can all say there are plenty of disagreement among the mayor's office, Metro Council, and the planning commission, especially nowadays, but they all agreed and support this zoning reform. If you have an opportunity, we posted on our website. The mayor have a press release in July, and Metro Council and Planning Commission adopt its separate resolutions in August. So in that resolution, we outlined the history of planning and zoning in Louisville, not just like we need to do the reform, but outline the history and tells you why we need to do reform and why we need to talk about the history. And by adopting those resolutions, it also means the city, the community, and Metro Council and the Planning Commission recognize and acknowledge the history of planning and zoning in Louisville, which is not pretty. I'm going to touch it a little bit, but because of the time, I'm going through this very quickly. This could be 20-minute presentation. I'm going to condense it. To begin with, all these programs, the policies, the zoning, and the practice, behind that, there's planners are very much part of that. I was very uncomfortable talking about this early on, the profession, planning that I love. I was trained as a professional planner. I've worked as a professional planner for the last 20 years. But this is something we all need to confront and we all need to talk about and feel comfortable about. So I think some of you and many cities probably have some work done by the firm as headed by Harlan Bartholomew. And he was kind of early years, he developed first comprehensive plan, the first zoning, a lot of study all the way up to the 50s. So these are some of the language I like here from him and from his firm. So what tells me is that this discriminatory intent of Louisville is really kind of codified in the law, kind of used as example in all the policy and practice. This is not just Louisville. This is many cities, hundreds of cities across the country use a similar practice. So the huge impact. And now I would like to talk a little about the racial segregation ordinance. Stephanie talked about Baltimore. This racial segregation ordinance started in Baltimore 1910, and then Louisville copied a similar ordinance, but it ended in Louisville, which I'm really, really glad. There's a lawsuit coming from Louisville, Buchanan versus Worley, and that's a Louisville lawsuit. That lawsuit goes all the way to Supreme Court. It was actually 1917. This law was stricken down by Supreme Court. So it started in your city, Stephanie. It ended up in my city. So it was illegal after 1917 to have some ordinance like this blatantly promote segregation. And also, it didn't stop there. It doesn't mean since then we don't have any segregation issues. It transformed to other forms. Deed restriction, covenant, I don't even need to read this right there. People are probably very familiar with this. It's also, unfortunately, this is very effective. It's very effective of excluding people of color, like Tiffany and me, probably cannot live in any of the community that were created in those days. And what is ironic is that this was also stricken down by Supreme Court in 1948. The year after that in Louisville, there was another covenant that was created. We find it out 1949 was a similar language was created in that. Not only that, the racial covenant deed restriction also exclude corporations that are owned by African Americans. So not just people, but also corporations. And the lower left side here actually is a deed restriction of today. This is a very typical deed restriction. Now you cannot restrict or exclude people of color, but you can do it from economic means. So this one tells you, if you have a two-story building, this deed restriction have a minimum square footage of 2,700 square feet. And that's a huge new development. And how many people can afford that? So that's another way of discrimination. Redlining, I'm not even going to go into it because everybody knows every city has a redlining map. This is the Louisville 1933. And then slum clearance and urban renewal and highway construction. All of those impact negatively of our people of color. And in Louisville, actually, every census tract with a majority of African American are impacted by the slum clearance, urban renewal, and highway construction. So, and then we call it Louisville by design because our comprehensive plan 1931, 1958, 1970 all included language of protecting the good neighborhood and the expense of detrimental to our minority population and neighborhood. And this is a current zoning map. Zoning play a big role in segregation, racial segregation, creating economic disparity and environmental injustice. So this is our current zoning district map. As you can see, 75% of Louisville is zoned single family and single family only. That means you cannot even have accessory structure in these zoning district by right. With all of that, I mean, this is not just a one policy or practice or law dictate the outcomes in Louisville in terms of racial segregation, economic disparity, and environmental injustice. All of this combined that created those issues. So how are we going to do that? We do get support from the Mayor's Office, Metro Council, Planning Commission, but we need to engage the public. So that's where we are now. Metro Council gave us 6 months to come back with recommendation. Obviously, we're not going to do all the work, correct the wrongs in 6 months for 100-year worth of wrongs. So what we're going to do is going to talk to our community. We have 3 community meetings scheduled next month. Actually next week, starting next week, we're going to have community discussion. We've been already talking to a lot of our neighborhood groups, a lot of organizations, and different group of people as we speak. And we have conducted research, data analysis. That's where we are at now. And later this year, we're going to draft the recommendation based on what we heard from the citizens, from the organization, especially our underrepresented population. So instead of doing a standard meeting, we also trying to reach out to as many as possible. A lot of people in West Louisville, where a great majority of people, African-American, do not have access to technology. There's no internet, a lot of people. So what we're going to do, we created a hotline so people can call us. And I also am fortunate enough to be invited to one of the radio shows that's very popular among African-Americans and talk about this project and talk about the history. That's very important. I know my time is up. I would encourage everybody to contact us. We also need some suggestions from other cities. This is something new to us. We're just doing for Louisville. We didn't know we catch some national attention, but that's fine. We would like to learn from other cities. We would like to contribute and help other cities. So these our contact information. We created a separate email address just for this project. We created a hotline. We also have a dedicated website. So if you want to contact me or give us some suggestions or ask questions, these are the contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily and Stephanie, for those tremendous presentations. I know we're at time, so I won't go into too many questions today, But I hope that you and all of our participants think of this as the first part of a conversation rather than the only time we get to talk about this. You have the contact information for our speakers on the slides in front of you, and we'll make sure that you have access to the recordings and presentations as well. I would also encourage you again to sign up for the Legacy Cities mailing list, as we will make more opportunities for peer exchange, and as well as more educational opportunities like webinars available to you. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.